Welcome. I am going to read you a very famous poem, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveller. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though, as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet, knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. We are faced with a myriad choices every day. Some of these choices will determine who we are, who we will become. There is a most evocative image in Shakespeare's Macbeth. It's Act 3, Scene 5. Macbeth, having chosen to murder his king, Duncan, in order to usurp his crown, finds that he is set on a course of bloody murder, killing his dear friend Banquo, Lady Macduff and her children, and anyone who gets in his way. He says, I am in blood stepped in so far, should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go all. These are the dire consequences of choice. Macbeth finds that he can never retrace his steps to innocence. In real life, the ramifications of our choices are often quite obscure at the moment of taking that decision. So that in the end, our choices may be based less on rationalizing and rather more on instinct. Robert Frost's famous poem, The Road Not Taken, is deliberately full of mist. It is as if the meaning is clouded over, obscure. It seems as if the poet's meaning is clear, 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveller. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. It seems as if we have an iconic representation of the journey of life, doesn't it? The road travelled, a choice that has to be made for the future, a fork in the road, doesn't it? But when we analyze it more closely, it is not as simple as it seems. In fact, 2 years before Robert Frost died, he complained that his readers and critics had misinterpreted the poem, and he called it tricky. Robert Frost was born in 1874 and he died in 1963 at the age of 88. In 1911, the ownership of the family farm passed to him. But in 1912, Frost took the momentous decision to sell the farm. And this was after they had actually tried farming and failed. He decided to sell the farm and from the proceeds try to start a new life in England. He was nearly 40 years old. He hadn't published a single volume of poetry, just a handful of poems in magazines, and he was becoming disheartened. The decision to sell and move to England was a momentous one. Luckily for him, publishers there were more receptive to new talents. And he managed to get his first volume of poetry published by the next year, 1913. It was called A Boy's Will. His second volume of poetry was published in 1914, called North of Boston. He wrote the poem, The Road Not Taken, after sailing from the USA to England, and it was published in 1915 in the Atlantic Monthly that year. He decided to use it as the opening poem of his collection, Mountain Interval, published in 1916. Given that The Road Not Taken was thus a kind of curtain raiser for his career, the context in which the words seemed to mirror the weighty choice that Frost had made in leaving the security of New Hampshire, where he lived, to try his luck at becoming a poet in England, it is hardly surprising that many readers interpreted his poem as signifying the importance of choosing the road less taken, less travelled, in this case, of earning his living as a poet, or of readers interpreting the words of the poem as a tribute to individualism. Even the description of the two roads diverging in a yellow wood is an interesting one. In Shakespeare's sonnets, as in the works of John Keats, and even in literature in general, autumn is often used as a literary trope, isn't it, in order to signify aging. And this echoes what was happening in Frost's life at the time. Being in a wood, uncertain of which path to take, may also echo Dante's journey of life. Midway through the journey of his life, Dante finds himself in a dark wood, una selva oscura. And having lost the direct route, we, the readers, are invited to read our own experiences into this. To an extent, this is the same kind of invitation. It's an unspoken invitation, isn't it, that readers have responded to over the years in interpreting Frost's The Road Not Taken through their own personal experience. Frost's tone is meditative and reflective. He stands at the crossroads, weighing up the pros and cons in a quiet and studied manner. The only thing that seems to mark the chosen road preferable is the fact that it wasn't as well trodden as the other. In stanza 2, then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. But he had no sooner made this claim than he contradicts himself. This highlights a sense of confusion, and the confusion that besets him in having to make a choice, in having to take a decision, whether the decision is a dire one or whether it is an ordinary one. The persona admits that both paths were really about the same. It becomes clear that all attempts to rationalize the choice happen in retrospect, and that his choice is really based on an arbitrary thought or on instinct more than on rationalizing. His immediate feeling is one of regret for the road not taken, and he tries to gloss over this regret Oh, I kept the first for another day. But he has no sooner said this than he rescinds the thought. And this highlights how we regret our decisions, but once they are taken, it becomes impossible to retrace our steps. Yet, knowing how way leads to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. This fits hand in glove with the title of the poem, which is The Road Not Taken. Far from urging us to take the less trodden path of individuality, the poem seems to highlight a sense of loss and regret over leaving the road not taken unexplored, as this might have made all the difference. But we don't know if this difference would have been for the better or for the worst. Once again, biography casts a different shade of meaning on the significance of the poem. Frost claims that this poem was originally written and conceived in a much more light-hearted way. It was intended to be a general mockery of his good friend and English poet, Edward Thomas. Thomas and Frost often went on long walks together. But Thomas was such an indecisive person that he would dither endlessly over which path to follow. This even extended to whether he should go to war or follow Frost to America. He ultimately chose to go to war, and this ended tragically with his death in the Battle of Arras in 1917. Frost complained to Thomas that when he taught this poem to college students, they had taken it pretty seriously, he said, despite doing my best to make it obvious by my manner that I was fooling. However, Frost is also known for saying, I am never more serious than when I am joking. And so, a multiplicity of possible meanings become possible in this poem. The famous last stanza of the poem turns from the perplexity of having to choose into narrative. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere, ages and ages hence, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. is the poem really about how we rationalize and justify our decisions in retrospect. Which of us has not slipped into doing this? 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. It is as if the power to shape the events of our lives does not come from being active and making decisions and taking choices, but rather from the ability to reconstruct, redesign, and mold the past into a particular story that defines and justifies our experience of the past. Catherine Robinson points out that the language in the final stanza is archaic, stylized, and reminiscent of fairy tales. It is certainly true that the line "somewhere, ages and ages hence" echoes the traditional fairy tale beginning, long, long ago in a faraway land. I believe that the hint of regret in "I shall be telling this with a sigh" is swept away into the magical world of fantasy and fairy tale and legend. I believe that this adds universal significance and captures the iconic moment of standing at the crossroads of choice. The marked rhyme pattern sustained throughout the poem adds a sense of magic to the last lines. The repetition of the word "I" in the last 3 lines adds emphasis and gives weight to the conclusion of the poem. And I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. While it is no secret that Robert Frost loved form, it is scintillating to see just how well his use of the repeated rhyme pattern ABAAB conveys his meaning, along with the general use of "I am," the repetition of stressed and unstressed syllables. This captures so well the conversational tone that it draws the reader into the conversation and into the poem. Great works of art generally have multiple interpretations, and it is even possible that although the poem may have begun as a gentle mockery of his poet friend Edward Thomas, that Frost himself may have begun to view the poem as being more about his personal life. It is interesting that when he read this poem to a Russian audience a few months before his death, he read it as a statement about his own decision to give his life to poetry. He was even more personal when he read the poem to a Boston audience a few weeks before he died. According to Larry Finger, with that reading, he was saying goodbye. This implies that he may have had a presentiment about his imminent death. It would be impossible for him to reconsider, rewrite the path that ultimately chose him. It is interesting too that he chose to use this poem for his last reading. And it is hardly surprising that the poem that was in itself initially used as a curtain raiser for his career should be the very poem to close the curtain on his life and on his career as a poet. Please remember to click the bell below and subscribe, and visit me at my website, 4muse.org.